I want to start by telling you something honest. Before I met them, I thought I understood war. I had read the reports. I had studied the casualty projections. I had sat in chambers carved from living moonstone and listened to generals with 4 arms and 3 hearts describe the mathematics of conflict, as though war was a formula you could balance on both sides of an equation. I believed them. That was my first mistake. My name is Vethorin. I was a field diplomat attached to the 14th Expeditionary Force of the Keth Collective. My job, in the simplest terms, was to follow the soldiers in and talk to whoever was left standing after the shooting stopped. I was not a combatant. I wore no armor. I carried no weapon. My only protection was a diplomatic seal embroidered on a pale gray robe, and the assumption that even enemies respect the neutrals. That assumption almost got me killed 17 times in 4 months. But I'm not writing this to complain about my own suffering. I'm writing this because of what I saw happen to them. The humans. And because what I saw is going to matter very soon, and the people who need to hear it most are the ones who have already decided not to listen. Let me tell you where it started. The planet was called Veerdas by our charts. The humans called it something that translated roughly to the mudhole at the edge of nowhere, which should tell you something about how they viewed strategically valuable real estate. It was a border world, disputed, ugly, and perpetually damp. The atmosphere was breathable for most species but heavy, the way a wet blanket is heavy. It pressed down on you from the moment you stepped off the transport. The sky was the color of an old bruise. Not dramatically so, not the kind of bruised sky you'd see in art, just tired-looking, yellowish-purple at the edges, gray in the middle, like the planet itself was exhausted and couldn't quite manage a proper sunrise. The 14th Expeditionary had been tasked with pacifying the sector. Pacifying, that was the word they used in the briefings. I have come to understand that pacifying and fighting humans are 2 concepts that have never successfully shared the same sentence in the real universe, only in the briefings. We landed outside the primary settlement, 300 Keth soldiers, full combat configuration, supported by 2 Yeth-heavy gunship squadrons and a complement of Draal engineers who were supposed to be building occupation infrastructure before the first engagement was even finished. That's how confident the command structure was. The engineers were already on the transport. They brought prefabricated administration buildings. Someone in logistics had already printed currency exchange materials. I remember standing at the edge of the landing zone, watching the Draal engineers unpack their equipment and thinking, this seems premature. The settlement in front of us looked like approximately nothing. A few dozen low structures made of reclaimed composite and local timber. Some kind of agricultural operation on the southern edge, fields of something tall and rust-colored in the perpetual damp wind. A water tower, a handful of ground vehicles in various states of mechanical dignity. Population estimate, 400 humans, maybe 450. Our force, 300 combat-rated Keth plus air support. The math, as the generals like to say, was self-evident. What the math didn't account for was the specific 400 humans who had chosen to live on a disputed border world with a sky that looked like a bruise and soil that sucked at your boots, and no particular safety net if things went sideways. Those specific 400 humans had not come to Veerdas by accident. They had come because they liked it hard. The first contact was peaceful. Aggressively peaceful. That was how one of our tactical officers, a veteran named Prelsath, described it afterward. She said it was the most unsettling thing she'd encountered in a decade of field work, and she had once negotiated a hostage situation on a volcanic platform above a methane sea. 3 humans came out of the settlement to meet us. They came on foot, no vehicles, no visible weapons. They walked across the open ground between the settlement's edge and our forward position with the kind of unhurried steadiness that you see in people who are either completely unafraid or have made a very specific decision about being afraid and moved through it to somewhere quieter. 2 men, 1 woman. The woman was in front. She was not a large human, they rarely are, honestly, even the imposing ones, but she moved like the ground belonged to her. Weathered face, the kind of weathering that comes from actual weather, not decorative aging. Her hair was short and gray at the temples. She was wearing work clothes. Actual work clothes, the kind with dirt still on the knees. She looked at our 300-soldier formation with its gunships overhead and its engineers already unpacking in the back, and she did something that none of us expected. She looked annoyed. Not frightened, not impressed, annoyed, the way you're annoyed when someone parks their vehicle in your spot. She said, and I was close enough to hear this, my translation implant working in real time, "You're in my field." Our commanding officer, General Vostereth, was a decorated veteran of the Schelm campaign. He had 3 commendations for tactical brilliance and a reputation for decisive action. He stared at this small, annoyed woman in dirty work clothes for approximately 4 full seconds before he managed to respond. He told her that by authority of the Keth Collective, the settlement and surrounding territory were hereby under provisional administration, and that the civilian population should. She interrupted him. She said, "I heard you the first time. I'm saying your landing burned my field." There was a silence. Prelsoth told me later that she knew in that moment that the math was wrong. She said she couldn't explain it logically. She just knew. The way you know a structure is going to fall before you see the crack. The woman's name, we later learned, was Mara Callahan. She had been on Veerdas for 11 years. She had built the settlement, largely by hand, from nothing. She was also, though we didn't know this yet, a retired combat veteran of something called the Meridian Border Wars, which humans fought among themselves in an earlier period, and which, by the available records, had been extraordinarily savage. She shook our general's hand when he offered it, because humans do that, and she said, quite politely, that the settlement would cooperate with whatever administrative requirements were necessary, but that she wanted it noted for the record that someone owed her 40 square meters of rust grain. We noted it for the record. The engineers kept unpacking. The first 3 days were quiet. Not peaceful, there's a difference, but quiet. Our soldiers established perimeter positions. The humans went about their routines. They farmed. They maintained their equipment. They moved between buildings at normal rhythms. They occasionally waved at our perimeter soldiers, which the soldiers found confusing and slightly threatening, because on most occupied worlds the population does not wave cheerfully at armed occupiers. I spent those 3 days walking the settlement. It was my job, assess the civilian population, identify potential friction points, establish communication channels. I went with a small escort and no weapons, per diplomatic protocol. What I found in those 3 days would not have alarmed a standard assessment. The population was physically diverse. Humans come in extraordinary variety and demographically unusual. Very few children, very few elderly. The overwhelming majority were adults between roughly 25 and 50 of their years, and nearly all of them had the specific quality that Mara Callahan had. That unhurried steadiness, that sense of having made a decision about fear and moved through it. What I didn't understand yet was why that demographic was so consistent. I understand now. They self-selected. The people who stayed on Veerdas after the initial colonization were the ones who couldn't quite make themselves leave. The ones for whom hard was not a deterrent. The ones for whom the bruise-colored sky and boot-sucking soil felt, in some specific and difficult-to-articulate way, like home. Those are a particular kind of human. I didn't know this yet. I was still doing math. The trouble started on the 4th night. Not with the humans. I want to be clear about that, not with the humans. One of our junior officers, I will not name him because this account is already suppressed, and I don't want to give anyone an easy target, made a decision that was not authorized, not sanctioned, and not even operationally logical. He was young and he was nervous, and he had, I think, been listening to too many of his own briefings about human primitive emotional behavior, and had decided, incorrectly, that a show of force would be useful. He ordered his unit to detain 3 humans they found walking near the perimeter after the settlement curfew. There was no actual curfew. No one had established one. The junior officer had decided there should be one. The 3 humans they detained were a man named Cooper, who was the settlement's mechanical technician, and 2 younger humans whose names I didn't get initially. Cooper was in his mid-40s, large even by human standards, with hands the size of small planets and the unhurried quality of someone who has fixed engines his entire life and knows that panic makes things worse, not better. When the soldiers stopped them, Cooper asked very calmly what the trouble was. The junior officer told them the curfew. Cooper said there wasn't one. The officer said there was now. Cooper looked at him for a moment, just looked, the way you look at something that is broken and you're trying to determine what broke, and then he said, "All right. What do you need us to do?" He cooperated completely. So did the other 2. They were detained for approximately 6 hours, asked questions that didn't make much sense from a military intelligence standpoint, and released before dawn. I heard about this the next morning. I filed a complaint immediately. The junior officer was reprimanded by Vostureth, who was intelligent enough to understand that unnecessarily antagonizing the civilian population was operationally counterproductive. But the thing about a bell is, you can't unring it. I went to see Cooper that afternoon. I apologized on behalf of the collective, not standard diplomatic procedure, but it felt right. He was under one of the settlement's ground vehicles at the time, half invisible from the waist down, doing something mechanical with a wrench the size of my forearm. He rolled out from under the vehicle and looked at me. He had oil on his face and his hands. He said, "Not your fault, right?" I said, "No, not directly." He said, "Then you don't need to apologize. But tell your people, the ones that need to hear it, that we notice things. We keep track." He said it pleasantly. No edge in it, just a statement of fact. He went back under the vehicle. I stood there for a moment. We keep track. I should have filed a different kind of report after that conversation. I should have flagged it as significant. I think, in some part of my mind that I was choosing not to listen to, I knew it was significant. I wrote it down in my personal notes and marked it for later consideration. We didn't get to later the way I'd planned. The engagement started 7 days after our landing. I'm not going to spend pages on the tactical details because other reports exist for that, and because this is not a military analysis. What I want to tell you about is what I personally witnessed, what I heard, and what it felt like to be standing in the middle of it. The humans didn't attack. That's the first thing I need you to understand, because the official framing of those events has consistently gotten this backwards. The humans did not initiate offensive action. What they did was demonstrate, comprehensively and at great cost to our operational confidence, that they had been watching us for 7 days and had learned things about our tactical patterns that we had not intended to reveal. On the morning of the 7th day, Vostureth ordered a forcible entry into the settlement's central storage facility to conduct an arms search. This was done without the diplomatic notification protocol that we were supposed to follow. The general had decided the protocol was too slow. Mara Callahan met the soldiers at the storage facility door. She was holding a mug of something hot, steam rising from it in the damp morning air. She said, "I'd like to see the authorization." Vostureth, who was not personally present, had not provided one, because the protocol he'd bypassed required one. The officer in charge of the entry team, not the same junior officer as before, a different one, told her it was under collective authority. She said that's not how authorization works. The officer told her to step aside. She took a sip from her mug. She stepped aside. And then the next 6 hours happened. I was at the perimeter monitoring station when it started. I heard the first shots and didn't immediately understand what I was hearing because the sound was wrong, not where I expected it, not the right direction, not the right rhythm. The shooting wasn't coming from the settlement. It was coming from behind us. Not many shots, controlled, precise, placed in intervals that I later understood were timed to create maximum disruption to our communication coordination rather than maximum casualties. The humans were not, in that first engagement, trying to kill us wholesale. They were, and this took me an embarrassingly long time to recognize, talking to us, in the only language they had concluded we would actually hear. Because 3 days of Mara Callahan's polite compliance and Cooper's quiet we keep track, and 400 humans going about their routines with that unhurried steadiness. None of that had communicated what they needed to communicate. So they said it differently. 4 firing positions. Well concealed, our sensors hadn't flagged them because the humans had constructed them gradually over 7 days, adding a little material at a time so the change was below our detection thresholds. Patient, methodical, careful. We keep track. Our forward position took 2 casualties in the first exchange, non-lethal, both soldiers injured rather than killed, which I understand now was not an accident. The humans chose that. They could have killed them. They made a different choice, and that choice was also a message. Vostereth called an immediate halt to the storage facility operation. He repositioned our defensive perimeter. He ordered air support to stand by. The shooting stopped. There was, for approximately 20 minutes, silence. Then Mara Callahan walked back into view from the direction of the settlement, not from any of the firing positions, still holding her mug, which I am reasonably certain she had refilled. She said she wanted to talk. Vostereth, to his credit, agreed. I was present for that conversation. That's my job. I sat at a folding table in the open ground between the settlement and our lines, with Vostereth on one side and Callahan on the other, and I listened. She was very clear. She said that the settlement would not accept occupation. She said this not as a threat, but as a statement of operational reality, the way you tell someone the bridge was weight limited. She said the people of Verdas had chosen this place specifically and deliberately, and had invested significantly of themselves in it, and they were not going to hand it over because someone showed up with math that said they were outnumbered. She said, and this is the part that I want you to understand, the part that I keep coming back to, we know you have air support. We know you have more soldiers than we do. We know all of that. It doesn't change our answer. Vostereth asked her what she thought the outcome of continued resistance would be. She said she didn't think about outcomes in the way he meant. She said outcomes were what happened at the end of things. She was interested in what was happening right now, which was a conversation, and she would like to keep having it if he was willing. He was. I don't think he entirely understood what was happening in that moment. I barely did. But I wrote down everything she said, and when I read it back later, in the quiet after everything had gone wrong, I understood. She was not negotiating from a position of weakness with false bravado. She was not bluffing. She was telling him an absolute truth in the most direct terms she had available, that these people were not going to stop, and that what he did next was going to determine the shape of everything that came after. She was giving him a choice. The next 4 weeks were the most educational period of my professional life, and that is a deeply inadequate way to describe them. I want to be honest about what I saw because I think there is a tendency, and I have seen it in other reports, including some that were filed by people who were there, to describe what the humans did in terms of tactics and strategies and capability assessments. And those things are accurate as far as they go. But they miss the texture of it. They miss what it actually felt like to watch it happen. Vostereth chose to continue the operation. He did not escalate to the air support option. He was not completely without judgment, but he did not withdraw either. He decided, I think, that what had happened on day 7 was an anomaly, a demonstration, a test of resolve, and that continued presence would eventually exhaust the settlement's ability to resist. He had done the math. The math said the humans would run out of things to fight with before we ran out of soldiers. The math was not wrong exactly. It was just measuring the wrong things. What happened over the following 4 weeks? Our perimeter positions were never fired upon twice from the same location. Every engagement came from a new angle, a new concealment, a new approach. Our pattern recognition systems worked by learning from repetition. They were designed for enemies who, eventually, used the same playbook. The humans never used the same playbook twice. Our supply lines experienced consistent low-level interference. Not attacks. The distinction is important. The vehicles weren't destroyed. They arrived late, or arrived with minor malfunctions that required time to diagnose, or arrived having taken slightly longer routes because the direct roads had developed new obstacles that weren't there before. Nothing that crossed the threshold of an engagement. Everything that required constant, exhausting attention to maintain baseline functionality. Our soldiers started sleeping poorly. This sounds small. It's not small. Sleep deprivation is a weapon, and the humans understood this. I think some of them had fought wars where it was a deliberate strategy, and they deployed it with patience and precision, not with anything dramatic. Just with a persistent ambient uncertainty, a sense that the perimeter was always slightly less secure than it appeared, that something might be different tonight than it was last night, that the quiet was not the same as safe. 3 weeks in, I watched Prelsoth, the veteran, the woman who had been calm above the methane sea, flinch at a sound that turned out to be a ground animal moving through brush outside the perimeter. She didn't comment on it. She just registered it, checked it, cleared it, and went back to what she was doing. But I noticed, and I think she knew I noticed. I started spending more time on the settlement side of things. Partly because it was my job. I was supposed to be monitoring the civilian population, and partly because I found, increasingly, that I could think more clearly there than in our command compound. The settlement operated at a different frequency than I was used to. The humans went about their work with the same steady unhurriedness they'd had on day 1. If they were exhausted, and they must have been, maintaining that level of vigilance for weeks, they didn't show it in a way I could easily read. What I noticed instead was a quality of attention that I found hard to describe. They paid attention to everything. Not in a paranoid way, not with the anxious hypervigilance I was starting to see in our own troops. In a quiet, comprehensive, constant way, the way a farmer pays attention to weather, not because every cloud is a threat, but because the accumulated knowledge of many clouds helps you know this one. Cooper was a good example of this. I spent time with him in those weeks, partly because he was easy to talk to and partly because I think he was one of the people Mara Callahan trusted most. He would be working on something mechanical. There was always something mechanical to work on, and he would be completely absorbed in it. And then at some point he would pause and say something like, "Your night sentries changed rotation yesterday," without looking up. Not threatening, just observational. He noticed the rotation change and he mentioned it the way you'd mention a change in weather. I started writing down everything he said. There was a specific day, 4 weeks in, 2 weeks before the official end of the engagement, when I understood something that I hadn't understood before. It happened simply, the way important things often do. One of our soldiers, very young, barely through training, named HFY, who had spent most of the engagement looking quietly terrified and doing her job anyway, was doing a perimeter check at the edge of the settlement's agricultural area. It was early morning. The rust-colored fields were moving in the damp wind. A human boy, maybe 12 of their years, young enough that I'd barely registered his presence in my population assessments, came out of the fields carrying something. He stopped when he saw HFY. They looked at each other. HFY had her hand on her weapon. She hadn't drawn it. She was tense in the way she'd been tense for weeks, that persistent ambient uncertainty. The boy looked at her weapon, then at her face, then back at her weapon. Then he held out what he was carrying. It was food, some kind of fruit. I don't know the earth classification, round and dark-colored, that he'd apparently been collecting in the field. He said something. My translation implant caught it as, "You look hungry." HFY stared at him. She was not hungry, we had supplies, but she had the look of someone who was hungry in a way that food wouldn't fix. The specific exhaustion of sustained alertness with no clean resolution in sight. The boy didn't move. He just stood there, arm extended, offering this fruit, with the same basic unhurried steadiness that everyone in the settlement seemed to carry. HFY looked at the fruit for a long moment. She took it. I watched this from about 40 meters away, and I wrote it in my notes, and I sat with it for the rest of the day. That evening, I wrote the first draft of what eventually became this report. I wasn't sure what I was writing yet. I knew I was writing about something that the standard vocabulary of conflict assessment wasn't going to capture. What I understood that day, what the boy with the fruit made me understand, though I couldn't have articulated it immediately, was this. The humans were not fighting us. Or rather, they were doing something that their history would recognize as fighting, and that our military categories would classify as fighting. But that was not, in its fundamental nature, the same thing we meant by that word. What they were doing was enduring. Enduring in a specific, active, chosen way that was not passive survival, but was also not aggression. They were enduring our presence the way they endured the bruise-colored sky and the boot-sucking soil, as a condition of the world that they had decided they could live with and would outlast. And the specific quality of that endurance, patient, observant, steady, occasionally precise and devastating in its disruption of our operations, and then just as suddenly quiet again, was something our military thinking had no good model for. Because our military thinking was built on a foundation of, opponents have a breaking point, find it, apply pressure, they break. And the breaking point the humans had was somewhere that our applied pressure couldn't reach. I don't mean that mystically. I mean it operationally. The specific 400 humans on Veerdas had, whether by selection or temperament or both, a relationship with discomfort that was simply different from what we were modeling. The discomfort of sustained conflict was not, for them, a threshold to be crossed into collapse. It was a texture of life that they knew how to inhabit. We keep track. Not a threat, not bravado. A description of their relationship with time. Note from archivist, the 3 dissenting votes were Keth representatives. The 11 votes in favor of dismissal were from non-contact species. Draw your own conclusions. The engagement on Veerdas ended, if ended is the right word, which I'm not sure it is, in the 6th week. Not with a battle, not with a surrender, not with the dramatic resolution that the briefings had implied was inevitable. Vostereth requested a formal meeting with Callahan. He had done another round of math, I think. Or maybe he had finally done the right math. The one that measured not casualties and supply levels, but something harder to quantify, like what was being spent to maintain operations and what was being gained by continuing them, and whether those 2 numbers were moving in a sustainable direction. They met at the same folding table, same positions, the damp wind moving through the rust-colored fields behind the settlement. Vostereth said, "And I was there, I recorded this. I want to understand what you want." Callahan said, "I want what I said I wanted on day 7. We stay, you go." He said, "That's not a negotiating position." She said, "No, it's not." There was a long pause. He said, "The collective has strategic interests in this sector." She said, "I know that." He said, "Those interests don't go away because you're uncomfortable with occupation." She said, "I know that too." He said, "Then help me understand what you think happens next." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said something that I wrote down 3 times because I wanted to make sure I had it right. She said, "What happens next is that your council does math. Your math says we're not worth the continued cost. Then you find a different way to pursue your interests in this sector that doesn't require holding 400 stubborn people on a planet they've already decided to die on. That's what happens next. I've seen it before. I just thought I'd save us both some time by telling you up front how it ends." Vostereth was quiet for a moment. He said, "You've done this before." She said, "My species has been doing this for a very long time." The 14th Expeditionary withdrew from Vaerdas 14 days after that conversation. The official record describes it as a strategic redeployment due to shifting priority assessments in the sector. I filed a supplementary report that described it more accurately. That supplementary report was classified Sub-Level 9 within 3 days. I returned to Keth Central carrying everything I'd written, everything I'd observed, and the specific weight of having watched something happen that I didn't have the right vocabulary for and was deeply worried about. I requested a council audience immediately. I was told to submit a written summary and wait for scheduling. I submitted a written summary. I waited. The council chamber at Keth Central is built to impress. This is not accidental. The chamber was designed specifically. I've read the Architectural Commission documents from its construction 3 centuries ago to position the council members at a height advantage over anyone presenting to them. The chair arrangement, the lighting, the acoustics that make voices from below sound slightly smaller than they actually are, all of it was deliberate and intentional, and has presumably worked on countless presenters over 3 centuries, making them feel appropriately humble before the assembled wisdom of the collective's governance. I walked in there 2 months after Vaerdas and felt the architecture trying to do its work on me. And I thought about Mara Callahan at her folding table in the damp wind, and I felt not contempt for the chamber exactly, but a kind of clarity about what it was for and how much that mattered compared to what I was about to say. 14 council members. Most of them I recognized. Reth Voss, no relation to the general, who was the chair of external affairs, a cautious bureaucrat with a gift for procedural delay. Ing Caleth from the Science Directorate, who was brilliant and genuinely curious but had never left the orbital platforms. Several faces I knew from smaller advisory bodies, people who had spent their careers in chambers and not in the field, people for whom the universe was a thing that happened in reports. 3 Keth representatives, my own people. They looked worried before I'd said a word. I stood at the presentation podium and I took a breath, and I told them what I'd seen. I want to reproduce here the core of what I said. Not the full testimony. That document exists in its original form elsewhere in the archive if you know where to look, but the parts that matter most, the parts that got the reaction they got. I said, in 6 weeks of sustained engagement on Vaerdas, a force of 300 combat-rated Keth soldiers with air support was effectively exhausted to strategic withdrawal by 400 civilian designation humans with limited access to formal military equipment. This was not an anomaly. This was not exceptional human behavior. Based on my analysis of the historical record and my observations during the engagement, This was a representative sample of what sustained conflict with human populations consistently produces. Rethvas interrupted me. He asked if I was claiming that humans were militarily superior to Keth forces. I said no. I was claiming that the framework of military superiority was the wrong tool for assessing the problem. He said, "Explain that." I said, military superiority is a measurement of comparative force capability. Who has more soldiers, more weapons, better technology, greater logistical support? By every one of those measurements, we were superior on Veerdas. We withdrew anyway, because those measurements did not predict what actually happened. I said, what actually happened was a sustained engagement against an opponent that did not behave according to the models our military doctrine is built on. Human populations in conflict do not exhaust linearly. They do not have the breaking points our force calculations assume. They adapt continuously to tactical conditions. They learn at a rate that our pattern recognition systems cannot keep pace with. And they have. And this is the part that I cannot quantify but must report, a relationship with sustained hardship that appears to be, in some fundamental way, different from every other species in our contact database. I said, the Veerdas population had 400 people. The humans currently have, by collective census estimates, approximately 40 billion distributed across 63 inhabited worlds and approximately 212 active stations and colonies. The vast majority of those worlds were colonized in harsh conditions. Many of them were actively hostile at the time of colonization. The humans chose them. They built lives in them. They stayed. I let that number sit for a moment. I said, 40 billion people who have been selected, across generations, for a relationship with hardship that we do not fully understand and cannot accurately model. 40 billion people who have, in their own history, repeatedly demonstrated that they respond to existential pressure not by collapsing but by, and I am trying to find the least alarming way to say this, by finding new ways to push back. It didn't start as laughter. It started as something more polite, the shuffling and murmuring that functions, in formal settings, as the respectable relative of laughter. Rethvas didn't laugh. He was too controlled for that. But he did something with his expression that I can only describe as the diplomatic equivalent of a dismissive wave. He said, Representative Vethorin, you are describing a border conflict with an unorganized civilian population on a contested agricultural world. You are extrapolating from this to conclusions about one of the smallest sentient species in the contact registry. I said, I am extrapolating from 6 weeks of direct observation, plus 300 years of recorded human history. Yes. He said human history, their own records, self-reported, heavily subjective. I said, agreed, which is why I'm also extrapolating from 60 years of contact terra observations by multiple species, including the Drethians, who fought a sustained engagement with human colonists on the Pesh worlds and withdrew after 11 months, including the Yori Compact, who attempted to establish administrative control over the human station network in Sector 12 and were politely, but comprehensively, excluded from those stations within 2 years without a single formal engagement, including the Shahari, who... Inkalith interrupted. He was not dismissive, he was genuinely curious, I think, but his question was still the wrong question. He said, are you proposing that humans are inherently warlike? That seems to contradict the contact record, which shows human populations as broadly willing to cooperate, participate in trade agreements, engage in cultural exchange. I said, that's correct. They are broadly willing to cooperate. That's part of what I'm trying to explain. The same species that handed my soldier a piece of fruit through a perimeter fence is the same species that maintained a 6-week low-intensity conflict that exhausted a superior force to withdrawal. Those aren't contradictions. They're the same thing. A murmur from the chamber. I said, The humans cooperate when cooperation serves the relationship they want. They resist when the relationship being imposed on them is one they've decided they cannot accept. And the specific quality of that resistance, patient, adaptive, comprehensive, and apparently capable of being maintained indefinitely, is not what our models predict and is not what our force planning accounts for. Reth Voss said, "You're describing a border dispute, not a strategic threat." I said, "I'm describing a pattern." He said, "Your pattern consists of 2 data points." I said, "It consists of 60 years of contact era data plus the 300 years of pre-contact human historical record in which they fought approximately." I checked my notes. 430 significant interhuman conflicts, none of which resulted in the extinction or permanent subjugation of any human population. Every occupied human population in recorded history eventually stopped being occupied. A longer silence. Then, from one of the far seats, a voice I didn't immediately place, one of the non-Keth Council members, a Vreth Alliance representative, said something that I am going to record here exactly as my translation implant caught it. "They're a young species on a handful of colonies. Representative Vethorin, with respect, you've been in the field too long. You've caught what I believe the humans themselves call forest for the trees." And the chamber, not all of it, but enough of it, found this genuinely funny. I want to describe what that laughter felt like. Not what it meant strategically, not what it revealed about the Council's analytical failures. I'll get to those, but what it physically felt like to stand at that podium and hear it. It felt like Veer Das. Not the gunfire, not the long weeks of watching the humans patiently outmaneuver us. The specific moment on day 7 when I was standing at the perimeter monitoring station, and the first shots came from the wrong direction. And for a full second, I didn't understand what I was hearing because it wasn't what the models predicted. That same quality of wrongness, of something happening that the framework isn't built to account for. The Council was laughing because I was asking them to take seriously a threat that their framework categorized as a minor border species on a handful of colony worlds. And the math was obvious. Look at the numbers, Vethorin. Look at what they have and what we have. And the math said this was not a serious concern. I stood at the podium and I thought about Mara Callahan, saying this is not a negotiating position. And I thought about Cooper saying we keep track. And I thought about a 12-year-old boy holding out fruit to an exhausted soldier through a perimeter fence. And I thought about something else. Something that I'd read in the human historical record that I hadn't included in my testimony, because I couldn't work out how to make it land in a formal council chamber. I'm going to include it here, because this is my document and I can say what I need to say. There is a recurring pattern in human history that their own scholars write about extensively, and that I think we have consistently misread in our contact era analyses. The pattern is this: a human population, faced with a threat that the math says they cannot survive, does not process that math the way most species process it. Most species faced with unwinnable odds calculate the survival option. They withdraw, they submit, they adapt to the new condition. This is not cowardice, it is rational. Survival is the prerequisite for everything else. Humans do this too. Do not misunderstand me, humans are not suicidally irrational. They calculate, they survive. But there is a subset of human behavior, activated under specific conditions that I have been trying to characterize precisely and cannot quite, in which the calculation changes. In which the question becomes not how do we survive this, but what are we willing to spend to make sure this doesn't happen to the next group of us. And under those conditions, and these are not rare conditions in their history, they occur with notable regularity. The calculus of what they will endure shifts in a way that our models cannot predict. They fought for 11 years on a volcanic peninsula, vastly outnumbered, for the right to use a particular harbor. They maintained underground networks for years under occupations that executed people for possessing banned information, losing generation after generation to the effort, and never stopped. They launched technological programs in conditions of resource scarcity that, by every projection, they should not have been able to sustain, and sustained them, because the alternative was unacceptable. 430 significant interhuman conflicts. None resulted in extinction. None resulted in permanent subjugation. Every occupied human population eventually stopped being occupied. What I told the council was true, and they dismissed it. What I did not tell the council, because I couldn't find the words for it in formal testimony, is this. The humans know they survived. Their children know it. Their history knows it. The specific knowledge that their species has been in impossible situations before and found its way through them is not an abstract historical fact to them. It is a living part of how they understand themselves. And that self-knowledge changes something fundamental about how they encounter a threat. When Mara Callahan stood at the storage facility door with her mug of something hot and told the officer stepping aside wasn't the same as surrendering, she wasn't being stubborn for its own sake. She was drawing on 300,000 years of accumulated species knowledge about what happens when you don't step aside, and what that costs, and what it's worth. She was a library. Every human on Veer Das was a library. And we showed up with math. The session continued for another 2 hours. I presented the full tactical analysis of the Veer Das engagement. I presented the contact Terra data on the Drethian withdrawal and the Yori compact failure and 7 other documented cases of attempted administrative imposition on human populations, all of which had produced non-standard outcomes. I presented demographic projections for human expansion over the next 3 to 5 decades under current growth trends. The council heard all of it. At the end of the session, Rethvas asked for a procedural vote on whether the human question warranted elevation to priority assessment status. The vote was 11 to 3 against. The 3 votes in favor were the Keth representatives, the people who had soldiers on Veer Das. The 11 against were from species that had not had direct sustained contact with human populations in conflict conditions. I stood at the podium and watched the vote and felt something that I can only describe as the precise opposite of surprise. Because Callahan had told me how it would go. Not this vote specifically. She didn't know about this meeting, but she had told me at that folding table in the damp wind that what happens next is that someone does math and decides the cost isn't worth it and finds a different approach. The council had just done that math. They had decided the cost of taking this seriously, the administrative cost, the political cost, the cost of restructuring their entire model of the galactic landscape to account for something that didn't fit in their existing categories, was not worth paying. They were going to find a different approach. The different approach was wait and see. I want to talk about what wait and see means in this context, because I don't think the council fully processed the time horizon they were operating on. The human expansion rate is not dramatic by galactic standards. They move out from their home worlds gradually by their standards and ours. They're not flooding the settled regions. They're not in anyone's immediate space most of the time. But they are, consistently and without apparent intention to slow down, moving. Every world they settle the way they settled Veer Das, with people who chose it, who wanted it hard, who built something in conditions that other species would have assessed and walked away from. Every generation of settlers is a selection pressure. Every harsh world that they stay on and make work is producing more humans with that specific quality. The patient, observant, steady, enduring quality that exhausted my general to withdrawal in 6 weeks. In 3 decades, by the current projections I had at the time of my testimony, the human population will have nearly doubled, and will have settled an additional 40 to 60 worlds. In 5 decades, they will be, if the current pattern holds, the most numerous single species in the settled regions of this arm of the galaxy. At that point, the math changes. At that point, whoever is having the conversation about the human question is going to be looking at numbers that are very different from the ones the council looked at in that chamber, and the tools available for that conversation are going to be considerably more limited. Callahan told me, I've seen it before. She meant her own history. She meant the specific recurring human experience of being underestimated until the underestimation becomes the other party's problem. I believed her. I believe her still. Before I left Veyrdas, I went back to see Callahan. I'm not sure exactly why. Partly protocol, final diplomatic contact, proper closure of the engagement record, partly something else that wasn't quite protocol. I found her in her field, the one the landing had burned. She was working in it alone, kneeling in the soil, doing something careful and patient with the earth. New growth, I realized. She was replanting. She heard me coming and looked up. She had soil on her hands again. She always seemed to have soil on her hands. She said, "How'd it go?" I said, "The withdrawal will be complete in 14 days. She nodded like she'd known. I said, "I'm going to write a report about what happened here." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "You think someone's going to read it?" I said I hoped so. She said, "Hope's good. Hope's useful." She looked back down at what she was planting. "What kind of report?" I said, and I'm not sure why I told her this, but it felt right. The kind that tries to explain something that doesn't fit in the standard categories. She thought about that. She said, "You know what the problem is going to be." I said, "Tell me." She said, "The people who need to understand it are the ones who have never had soil on their hands. And it's hard to explain soil to someone who's only ever seen it in a report." She went back to her planting. I stood there for a minute, watching her work. Then I said goodbye. She said, "Take care of yourself, Vethorin." First time she'd used my name. I walked back to the transport. The sky above Veyrdas was its usual bruised color. The damp wind was moving through the rust-colored fields. Somewhere behind me, I could hear Cooper working on an engine, that steady rhythmic sound of something being fixed. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I already knew everything I needed to know about what was behind me. What I didn't know was whether the people in front of me would understand it before it mattered. What follows is not part of Vethorin's original document. I am adding it because I believe it is relevant and because I am, apparently at this point in my career, beyond worrying about what gets flagged. Vethorin filed this report 6 years ago. In the time since, human population has grown by an estimated 14%. 7 new worlds have been settled under conditions that Keth colonial assessors classified as inadvisable. All 7 are functioning communities. The Drethians have quietly restructured their border agreements with human-adjacent sectors, removing 3 contested territorial claims that had been unresolved for a decade. They issued no public statement about this. I have read their internal correspondence. They don't mention Vethorin by name. They don't need to. The Yori Compact has established a trade partnership with 4 human station networks. This partnership is, by any reasonable reading of the agreement terms, more favorable to the humans than to the Yori. The Yori signed it anyway. I understand why. The Keth 14th Expeditionary was restructured after Veyrdas. General Vostereth retired. Prelsoth was promoted. She has filed in the years since 6 reports that reference Vethorin's work. All 6 have been classified sub-level 9. Mara Callahan is still on Veyrdas. She's still farming. The rust grain field that was burned by our landing has fully recovered. Cooper is still fixing engines. The Council has not reconvened on the human question. The vote stands 11-3. The math is changing.